just like many other U.S. foreign policies in Iraq and the beyond region, in particular when it comes to the U.S. military withdrawals from Iraq. And unfortunately, we're seeing that the strategic dialogue between Washington and Baghdad has fallen a victim to many unnecessary discussions with a lack of clear objectives. We could look at it as through the lens of that the Biden administration and Kaldami's government might not theoretically be in favor for a full U.S. military withdrawal now or in the future from Iraq. But I think what they're doing is that they're both following an overarching agendas by their own respective governments with an attempt to overlap with one another, considering that they have a lot of agreements at the same time. While Biden is promoting less troops abroad in both Afghanistan and Iraq, Kaldami must be the parliamentary vote, which is Iraq's parliamentary vote to expel U.S. forces from the country in early January 2020. So, in other words, it could be seen as an attempt by the Biden administration to support Kaldami's image in Iraq prior to the early elections that are supposed to happen this October, as a compromise to the anti-government October protest movement. This, however, doesn't necessarily mean that Prime Minister Kaldami nor his former predecessors, such as former Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi, had real incentives to push away U.S. troops from Iraq upon the parliamentary vote. It's probably because it was, after all, the parliamentary vote was a responsive act to the pressures of the pro-Iran camp in Iraq's parliament, whom were seeking revenge for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the former leader of Quds Force, of IRGC, and PMF's former de facto leader, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis.
You know, there have been a lot of very alarming headlines on the part of some people saying that, oh, you know, the Americans are handing Iraq over to the Iranians to do as they so wish. But I mean, that's very simple to say, but it's not that in reality, is it? Because as we know, I mean, the number of troops remaining on the ground in advisory/training roles is still very much the same. So, I mean, American influence is actually not changing in Iraq at all, is it?
Yeah, so I really agree that this is much more of a semantic change. It's much more of a rebranding than really changing anything on the ground. And in many ways, you almost have to look at really what is not changing as opposed to what is changing. And the things that are not changing are that the primary mission is still going to be advising Iraqi forces, that there will be intelligence given, that airstrikes are allowed as long as the Iraqi government supports them, and that special operations forces are still going to be conducting operations partnered with the counterterrorism service. The Iraqi Special Operations Forces, probably the most capable and effective force in Iraq. Coalition and U.S. Special Operations Forces are still going to be paired and partnered with them. Additionally, the footprint, the size of the U.S. presence in Iraq at this point, which is about 2,500 soldiers, is not set to change. There are some kind of discussions, you know, the typical kind of background discussion that you hear from the, quote, senior administration official who is saying that, oh, there are ongoing discussions about what the footprint will look like. But at this point, really nothing has changed. Not much has changed. And it is a rebranding, most likely for kind of domestic political audiences, both within the United States and within Iraq, in my opinion.
What does this then mean for Iraq, right? So we've had this rebranding. Nothing's really changing on the ground as such because the U.S. has been in this role anyhow, advisory training. What does this mean vis-a-vis Iraq's relations with Iran as well? I mean, is it, as people are saying, that, oh, the Americans just handing Iraq over to the Iranians on a silver platter, essentially?
Well, of course, the Iran factor has been very problematic since the early stages of the U.S. invasion in Iraq. There are many stages since 2003 where people are considering Iran increasing and benefiting from the U.S. occupation of Iraq by increasing its influence across different sectors of the Iraqi state and Iraqi society. Before we look into this from the Iraqi lenses, we have to look at it through the lenses of the U.S. administration. You know, as to understand it through Biden's own perspective, this is probably part of a wider Biden strategy in the Middle East and the Near East to aim to shift the focus away from, the Middle East and the so-called terrorism, and, invest more focus into their own threats that they consider from China and the cyber warfare. But ending America's post-9/11 era by withdrawing troops from both Afghanistan and Iraq, even if it meant, the accurate and efficient security reforms not being in place in both countries, means they're doing the exact opposite job. So whatever, project they were aiming for, a successful project they were aiming for, the exact opposite outcome will happen. It's despite the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan being a fraught topic in Washington, in Iraq, the U.S. military withdrawal is likely to cause very different difficulties and not the same. And that is because, as we previously mentioned, the announcement is unlikely in practice to remove many of the 2,500 U.S. troops that are currently stationed there, as your guest mentioned.
Yeah.
Biden is aware that a change in U.S. troop designation is very unlikely to halt confrontations between the U.S. and Iran-backed militias in Iraq. So that makes us question the level of responsibility the U.S. government carries towards Iraq when they, present themselves as major partners with Iraq during these strategic dialogue discussions. So this rushed and unstudied decision is part of a typical and common and long U.S. military strategy in the region. The U.S. military intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan should have ended a very long time ago. In Iraq's case, since that's our topic, it could have ended at the U.S. invasion's ability in toppling the former dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and leave a democratic transition gradually managed by Iraq's own people. And yet they decided to remain in the country despite not finding the alleged weapons of mass destruction. Yeah. And Saddam Hussein was caught. And they continued to destroy the infrastructure, abolish the state institutions, damage the police and the armed forces, which eventually left the Iraq we know of today, a vulnerable, unsecured country with very unsecured borders, which motivated neighboring regional power players like Iran to exploit. ISIS originated from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the Iran-backed militias would have not existed in Iraq if the U.S. military intervention was only limited to the regime change element. Yeah. So Iraq's current security position is weaker than ever, with not only sleeping cells of ISIS, but even proxy networks driven by regional powers destabilizing the country based on the agenda of its proxy rulers. Yes, it would be very ideal to wish for Iraq to handle its own problems beyond Iran and the U.S., but leaving a more vulnerable Iraq to Iran, much more vulnerable Iraq than it was in front of Iran after 2003, makes it a bit unfair and unjust to leave a very weak military establishment destroyed from the occupation to face.
Zeidon, let me come in there.